from Washington, D.C.
All right, Bloomberg News editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite in conversation with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Thank you both for a fascinating back and forth. Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, of course, talking with Mark Rutte, as we told you. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kate Davison in Washington here. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kate, that was a fascinating talk on a day that we saw more troubling headlines from Eastern Europe. Denmark now investigating the incursion of Russian drones in its airspace. Pretty interesting to hear from the Secretary General on this issue after we saw the same in Estonia and in Poland.
Sure. And he said that President Trump's comments yesterday really hit a nerve. Also talked about Russia's economy. That was, of course, something that the president talked about. And we saw in his social media post and the Secretary General saying they appear to really be struggling, seeing long lines at gas stations. Right. And that's a big vulnerability. That's for sure. We're going to have a conversation about this coming up with Bailey Hutchison, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO. First, to the executive order that was signed just in the last hour. President Trump approving a deal to allow a group of American investors to buy the U.S. version of TikTok. According to the White House, just a short time ago, this deal values the company at about $14 billion. That number is new to us. It's been signed off, the president says, by Chinese President Xi Jinping. For the details as we understand them on this pending deal, we turn now to Bloomberg's Laura Davison, who joins us live here in our Washington bureau. Laura, is this deal done? Do we need to hear more from Beijing? Will there be paper on this?
This deal is far from done. This is essentially a step that allows the deal to proceed. There's still a bunch we don't know, including whether the Chinese have officially signed off on this deal. Trump says that they have, but the Chinese have not yet given their final approval. There's also a question of just who all is involved in this deal and what these stakes end up being. Bloomberg reported earlier today that sort of a consortium of 3 investors will own about 45% of the company. That's Silver Lake, that's Oracle, and that's MGX, which is a Abu Dhabi-based investment fund. Between the 3 of them, about 15% each, and then they'll also have some board representation. But what the other 55% looks like, still unclear as well. This is going to take another 3 or 4 months before they ultimately get through all the checks and balances on this deal. Laura, one of the elements the president talked about being the big benefit to the U.S. here is the potential tax revenue from this sort of deal. I mean, he's talked about that in terms of tariffs as well, the benefit, all the money coming into the U.S. How big of a difference would this actually make? Well, with a $2 trillion deficit that we're facing, if you look at, whatever the profits that TikTok might bring in at a 21% corporate tax rate, it's going to be a drop in the bucket. But this is, as Trump talks about all of these deals, whether it's the U.S. directly taking a stake in something like Intel, the tariffs, even, just sort of bringing U.S. companies, he keeps talking about tax revenue. He likes to see these very much in terms of, what's in it for the U.S., what is the sort of transactional, what's the dollars on the page that I can see as a benefit to the country. Fascinating as ever. Bloomberg's Laura Davison with the breaking news. We thank you, Laura, as always, joining us now with her reaction to this and much more, including this week's UN General Assembly, the latest NATO developments as well that we were just hearing about from the NATO Secretary General is Bailey Hutchison, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former Republican senator from Texas. Ambassador, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV. I can only imagine your thoughts around this conversation now of European nations projecting to Moscow that they are prepared to shoot down Russian jets if they incur violations of their airspace. Is this the right policy right now, or does this escalate an already tense situation?
I think it is time for the Europeans as well as the Americans to get very serious with Russia. I'm very pleased that they are doing it because Russia has been playing us along, trying to gain time, doing despicable things to the Ukrainian people. And I think it's time for us to say, we're not taking it anymore. And you should not be doing these things for the purpose of avoiding a peace agreement. We've asked, we've done everything, we've been patient, the Europeans have been patient, and I think having the Russians start flying over European territory is very provocative, and I think we should respond and say, we're not going to sit here and let you continue to string us along. We either are going to go to the peace table or we're going to have more sanctions that will hurt an economy that is already almost in the tank.
Madam Ambassador, how do you think that Vladimir Putin will respond to this warning, essentially, from these other countries?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin has not gotten the message, and we've given it all together, the President Trump, as well as the European leaders, have said time and again, we're going to give you time to go to the table to try to work this out. And Putin has played us along. And I think it is absolutely right for us to now be very hard with Russia, to say we are ready to now take it into our own hands and we're going to do more sanctions. They still have the option of taking the monetary wires off the Russian ruble so that Russia will not be able to use their currency in the global market, the SWIFT line and the Fed line. So it's time that we have consequences for these brutal acts that Russia is doing against the Ukrainian people.
I want to ask you about the president's recent turnabout when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I suspect that you saw his post on Truth Social just in the last 24 hours suggesting that Ukraine is now in a position to win back all of the territory it has lost from Russia. What do you make of this? Is it strategy? Is it Donald Trump's new belief? And is he correct about that?
Oh, I think he's definitely correct. And I think he has given Putin every opportunity to do the right thing. And that meeting that they had in Alaska was a big lift for President Trump to do. And Putin was still bombing Ukraine when he was on the way to and from Alaska. So you can't take him seriously. And I think the only thing that will make him take us seriously is to say, we've had enough. We are going to impose sanctions. There are 85 senators ready to pass the bill that would double down on sanctions. And we have other means to be able to take them out of commission in the global marketplace. And I think we have to do that. We don't want to hurt the Russian people, but Vladimir Putin is hurting the Russian people, and he's killing the Ukrainian people, and it is time that we all together with our European allies say enough is enough.
We heard earlier from the NATO Secretary General talking about Russia's economy, and he mentioned the central banker there who has managed to kind of keep the economy going despite a raft of sanctions that we've seen. So do you see that the economy there seems particularly more vulnerable? Might we be at a turning point where the additional sanctions could pack a bigger punch?
Well, I think, yes, that additional sanctions will. India and China have been major players in helping Russia, buying their oil and giving them what they do have to continue to bombard Ukraine. And now, the other thing that's come out is that the Russian defense spokesman said that they are taking a nuclear approach now, and they're starting to now wave a nuclear leverage with the Europeans. And that's got to stop. And I think Putin needs to realize that if he actually does anything that would indicate he's going to use nuclear weapons, that he will then lose India. I think that they have signaled that he should not do that, and he should lose China as well. I don't know if China would stand up or just say, don't do this, but I think that we have a lot of things that we can do on the monetary side that would be a clear indication to Putin that his time is up.
Some think it's amazing we're not doing them yet. Ambassador, we started by talking about Russia's incursion into sovereign airspace in Eastern Europe. We mentioned Denmark and what has happened there. In fact, they had to close their airport for some time. Hungary actually scrambled jets to take part in this interception near the Latvian border. A separate incursion here. They did not cross into NATO airspace, apparently, but it was, in fact, Hungary that met the moment. If Viktor Orban is asserting himself on behalf of NATO, what do you make of this moment, and what does it mean for Vladimir Putin?
Joe, you have hit the button. if Hungary is now saying you are doing too much, Putin, that is significant. And I think it is so important that Putin get this very strong message that his time is up. We have been patient. President Trump has been patient beyond anything that I've ever seen. Our senators are ready to act and say secondary sanctions at the least. And going forward, I think we have other financial capabilities. You know, Europe is holding 300 billion euros in Russian funds, and they could just start using that to help the Ukrainian people buy the weapons that they need to defend themselves against this onslaught.
Bailey Hutchison, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, we appreciate your insights as always. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg. As we stick with politics now and trade, the UN General Assembly is still underway in New York, and we want to head to Bloomberg's David Gura, who is joined by Anita Anand, Canada's Minister for Foreign Affairs. David?
Joe, thank you very much. Minister, thank you very much for being
Thanks
here
for having me.
as well. Let me start by asking you about what we've seen in terms of NATO response to the Russian incursions we've seen in recent days. Drones, jets, and Bloomberg today reported that some European diplomats traveled to Moscow to say if there are Russian jets in European airspace, they will not hesitate to shoot them down. What is Canada's position on how NATO should respond to these incursions going forward?
Excellent question because of the volatility in this area right now. I met with Mark Rutte yesterday, the Secretary General of NATO, and we were very careful in our conversation to lay out the fact that there is a process under the Washington Treaty, and it's important for that process to be followed. Article 4 for sure in terms of consultation, but also these are military decisions, and there is a process for military decisions to be made under the NATO guidelines and structure. And SACEUR in particular is fundamental in terms of the decision-making, not just on capabilities, of course, but the actual minute-by-minute decision-making. And so it would be imprudent for me to be preempting the decisions from a military standpoint that SACEUR would be making under the NATO framework. And I'm fully cognizant of these types of decisions, given that I was the Minister of National Defense of Canada for 2 years.
I was at the Council on Foreign Relations when the Prime Minister spoke, and he talked about secondary sanctions, and his counsel was that the international community should go quickly on those. What is that timeline as you see it in terms of imposing those sanctions on Russia?
Well, let's take a step back and ask why sanctions are even necessary at all. And that's because of the illegal and unjustifiable further invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2022. The work that the international community has been doing to rally around Ukraine, Canada, for example, $22 billion on the table, the largest per capita donor, and still looking to do more. The first country to actually execute on a Pearl, which is the $500 million amount set by NATO. The work that we will do regarding sanctions continues. I met with Andrei Sybiha, the Ukrainian foreign minister, today to discuss this, as well as sovereign assets, as well as what we can do on sanctions. Canada, of course, has already put on the table 4,000 sanctions of individuals and entities. So this work continues. All options are always on the table. As host of the G7, I am working with my other G7 foreign ministers on Ukraine, on the Middle East, on Haiti, to ensure that we have an approach that is responsive to the seriousness of each of those situations.
I think of the delicacy of the calculus here as Canada tries to strengthen some of these relationships with China, with India, that have been strained in recent years, and these sanctions, of course, would hit those countries hardest. How does that complicate your thinking about the imposition of those sanctions?
Well, of course, we have to be very, very attentive to the situation in Ukraine and to provide as much support as possible across a number of lines of assistance. At the same time, we also have our bilateral relationships with India, with China. I'll be traveling to India, Singapore, and China in the coming weeks. And it's important for us as a country to execute on our Indo-Pacific strategy, to develop lines of trade while making sure that we are attendant to issues of domestic public safety and law enforcement.
Let me ask you about this moment and this meeting that you've been participating in. You heard the leader of the largest economy in the world effectively say that this body doesn't do anything. It was a rejection of multilateralism as we know it. How do you, I don't want to say pick up the pieces from that, but listen to that and plot a path forward here with the United Nations? What does this body, the liberal order, look like going forward here in light of what we heard from the President of the United States?
Well, I wish this interview was longer, actually, because you're really preempting my speech on Monday to the United Nations, which is, yes, we are in a time where multilateralism is under threat, where countries retreat towards protectionism and unilateralism. And the question is, how do we, as believers in institutions of a multilateral nature, react? What is our response? And of course, as a country that relies so deeply on trade, as a country that has benefited from the rules-based international order, whether it is defense and security, NATO, whether it is trade and commerce, WTO, whether it is the United Nations itself, Canada has benefited and prospered as well as contributed to the multilateral order. And the question before us now, in this moment of geopolitical tension and the retreat towards protectionism, is how do we maintain this order? And the question that I've been putting on the table at various sessions is that it is not the time for those of us who believe in multilateralism to retreat. It is the time for us to continue to offer the very best of what makes us domestically successful as well as internationally collaborative, and that is working within the multilateral order for the benefit of all. The work ahead of us is monumental, but it must be done. And in terms of President Trump's comments, there were aspects of his remarks that may be interpreted as you said, but there were other aspects where we can all agree. He spoke about the importance of peace. In this time where we are seeing more and more conflict, armed conflict, it is more important than ever to ensure that we are working towards peace on a multilateral basis.
Minister, thank you very much. Minister Anita Anand here in New York. Back to you in Washington.
Bloomberg's David Gura. We thank you, David. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kate Davidson. I'm Joe Matthew. Major story we're following this hour. President Trump advancing plans to American investors to buy TikTok's U.S. operations from its Chinese owner, ByteDance. Officials setting a potential value now of $14 billion for the U.S. unit. Among those helping secure the algorithm, according to the president, Oracle, Dell, and the Murdoch family.
For a look at how markets moved off of today's data, we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romain Bostick, who joins live from world headquarters in New York.
Yeah, and that TikTok news that you were just talking about there, Joe and Kate, a $14 billion valuation being placed on it. A lot of questions about how the actual business will be run. But as far as managing that data and overseeing the algorithm, it does appear that one of the main beneficiaries will be Oracle. Those shares up about 1.5% in the after-hours trade after closing lower in the cash session by about 6%. The third straight day of declines as a lot of people take profits off of the phenomenal run in that stock. Dell shares also moving higher in the after-hours trade as well. And this may actually breathe maybe a little bit extra life back into the AI trade, an AI trade that has been driven, at least over the last few days and weeks, by policies coming out of Washington, including investments and stakes that the government is taking in some of those companies. But there are a couple of gray swans up ahead that the market is going to have to keep their eye on. Today, you saw moves higher in yields and a move higher in the VIX, and that was largely because of concerns that the rate cuts that are being priced into this market may not necessarily materialize given some of the strength that we continue to see in the U.S. economy. A upward revision in those GDP numbers earlier today, and some monthly data that seem to suggest that the economy is in pretty decent shape, or at least good enough shape that it doesn't need rate cuts. But of course, one big overhang for this market is whatever the heck is going on with the budget, a potential government shutdown. And I want to turn your attention to shares of Accenture, the big consultancy company, warning today that they are concerned about a potential cut in federal spending on some of these consultancy contracts. There was also an OMB memo that was floating around earlier today with regards to that potential government shutdown and the idea of just letting a lot of workers go should we actually reach that scenario. You saw Accenture, you saw Booz Allen Hamilton, and a lot of other names in that space. Federal contractors, Joe, move lower on the day.
All right, Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. It's great to have you back, as always. Romaine just mentioned the memo. And we're now, 6 days away from an impending government shutdown deadline, and Washington is already bracing for impact. Last night, that very memo was sent out from the Office of Management and Budget, directing agencies to plan permanent layoffs for federal workers and programs that do not align with President Trump's priorities if funding lapses. Democratic leaders pushing back against the White House, saying that they're ready to meet with Republican leadership, even the president, but that some key issues are non-negotiable.
We're just 5 days away from a government shutdown because Republicans have decided that they don't want to fund the government in a bipartisan way and are determined to continue to gut the health care of the American people.
Joining us now with his reaction to this and more, Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska. He's chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus. He's also a member of the House Financial Services Committee, which is why he joins us fairly often here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Good to see you, Congressman, as we count down. A lot of folks feel like it's a more likely scenario that we shut down today following the release of this memo from Russ Vought. The idea of mass layoffs following a shutdown could cut either way in this negotiation. And I'm wondering where your head is. Does that make Democrats less likely to pass a CR and see the layoffs happen? Or does it pull some senators from Virginia and Maryland with large numbers of federal workers in their states to a yes?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. And I like to call balls and strikes. And I'm very disappointed with the minority leader's comments that you just played there. What are we asking the Democrats to do? We're asking them to extend government funding until November 21st using the budget they voted for, the White House signed, and the House Republicans negotiated last Congress. That's not too much to ask. I'm simply saying just extend it so that we can have a budget. And here's what happened in March. Chuck Schumer, he did the right thing. He did his analysis. He did his political analysis. He thought about what was right for the country. He agreed to a continuing resolution on basically the same terms. And what happened to him for seemingly working with Republicans, more importantly, working with President Trump? He immediately lost 12 percentage points of popularity in New York. Hakeem Jeffries, Speaker Pelosi, all the rest of the Democrats started screaming at him. AOC said she was going to run against him. So he's doing the same thing this time, only he's not going to get caught like he did. He's going to play a bunch of games. He's going to run a bunch of flags up the poll. But if he does the right thing like he did in March, we will fund the government. There's no tricky business here. And ironically, the one thing that has them wrapped around the axle is Donald Trump, their nemesis. They know that if the government's not funded, their nemesis now has the keys to the kingdom, and this will all be on them. Listen, I ran for Congress to be an Article 1 appropriator. I don't want a government shutdown. I want our priorities in the budget, and I want us to negotiate with Democrats to get there, but this is not the way.
Congressman, the House passed its bill, but the Senate doesn't have the cards yet. Do you see the Senate making a deal on these ACA credits, and would you vote yes if a second CR comes your way?
I'm going to vote yes to fund the government. If the CR changes, I'm going to take a look at it. Listen, I've never not voted to fund the government. I have a hard time looking an air traffic controller in the face or explaining to somebody at the National Weather Service or walking into a grocery store where all of this hyperbole is happening and somebody that's 82 years old is worried about their Social Security check, even though that will still come. I don't want to put her through that. So If we are presented a CR that passes the Senate, I'm going to look at it. I want the government funded. I think this whole exercise of not having a funded government, it is not good for the country. It is not good to maintain the confidence of our citizens. And I'm really interested in a budget that includes our priorities in the 119th Congress. And that's the fruit on the tree that I want to be enjoying on or before November 21st.
Well, you said it, Congressman. If the government shuts down, President Trump and his budget director, Russ Vought, have the keys to the castle. And based on what we're reading in this memo, that's very real. Once fiscal year 2026 appropriations are enacted, it says, it's not just now, agencies should revise their RIFs as needed to retain the minimal number of employees necessary to carry out statutory functions. What do you expect the administration would do? This sounds like the Doge on steroids.
Oh, it's absolutely that. I mean, if anybody thinks that Donald Trump won't do that, they haven't been paying attention the last 9 months. Like, ultimately, that's not what I want either. Like, I ran for Congress to have the power of the purse to decide where the spending goes, to protect medical research and to get ag research and to make sure the National Weather Service is funded. No two people are going to agree on permanent job cuts. And I'm sure there'll be things the executive branch does that I'll be working to kind of communicate back. But I don't blame President Trump here. President Trump wants to reduce the size of government. So do I. The difference is, and I think he agrees with me, we want to do it in Congress. That's why I want the Appropriations Committee to work together. And I'm one member of Congress, along with everybody in the Main Street Caucus. We understand that involves getting 60 votes in the Senate, which means compromising and working our way through this process, which we've done for 250 years. Like, this is totally avoidable. And the fact that the Democrats are doing this, it's mind-boggling. But this is not about the budget. This is about Democrats fearing their far-left liberal base. They're angry. We see it every day. They're stoking all of this junk, on the internet about scaring people about their health care. They don't want to see their left-wing members working with Republicans. They're not interested in it. And this is Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries watering the far left's grass. And they have no choice but to do it. And it's sad.
So, Congressman, we need to ask you what the shutdown would mean for Nebraska. Your district, according to a Congressional Research Service report, has about 8,150 federal workers. How many of those workers would be fired by Russ Vought if there was a shutdown?
Well, I don't know the exact industries. I can tell you we have STRATCOM in my legislative district, which is the combatant headquarters for all of our nuclear triad, and they do enjoy some protection, as well they should because of their mission. But the things I worry about are having enough people to keep the Weather Service operational, making sure that we have USDA food inspectors in our food processing plants. We care very much. We have a very good FBI that's working. We have folks in the USDA with our ag programs, administering programs to farmers. So, anytime you're talking about cuts, everybody's got a different idea how we approach that. But more important than whatever OMB might do, when you aren't paying people and you're expecting them to work, saying we'll pay you with back pay, that ends up costing the government more money in the end to go through this exercise, which is completely unnecessary. And by the way, when the Democrats were in power, a lot of members also voted to fund the government on a continuing resolution there because we believe shutting down the government makes no sense.
I want to ask you about farmers that you just mentioned. When I think Nebraska, I think farmers. Congressman, President Trump made some news today. I don't know if he intended to when he was talking with reporters, but we haven't spent a lot of time on tariffs. And the president seems to think that the money coming in from tariffs could, in fact, go to your farmers now to help them make the transition to moving supply lines and evolving trade. I want to hear what he said, and we'll have you react. Here's President Trump.
We're doing well. Because of tariffs, we're doing unbelievable. We're making more money than we ever have made. And by the way, we're going to take some of that tariff money that we made, just to get off the subject for a second. We're going to take some of that tariff money that we made, we're going to give it to our farmers, who are for a little while going to be hurt until it kicks in. The tariffs kick into their benefit.
Do you know about this, Congressman? Will this require legislation? And how bad are the farmers feeling? What is needed to cure this pain?
Well, first of all, President Trump did this in 2017 when we went through the same exercise with China, Canada, and Mexico. And China right now, they're playing games. They're buying soybeans from Argentina. And so, yes, we have a problem. Our prices are low. Our inputs are high. The farmers need the help. And President Trump has always said that we're going to be there for them. This is another reason we can't govern with a CR very long. We will need the approval of Congress to do this. And America's farmers will need this. They want this. They would prefer that we had trading partnerships, that this would never be required. But until we can get the deal with China, and by the way, they know what they're doing. This is the hand of their playing. They want to be the world's sole superpower. We, in the breadbasket, like Nebraska, feed the world. We're already seeing better deals from the Trump administration. Our beef is now going to Australia and the United Kingdom. That's a huge win. Our milk, we're gonna stand firm so our dairy farmers aren't taken advantage of like they have been by Canada for decades. So we have things that need to get fixed. This economic aid that the president's talking about, I believe, is necessary. I love the fact that he brought it up. Every farmer in America appreciates the fact that he brought it up, regardless of their political position, because I think we're going to need it.
Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, thank you for joining us. Coming up, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is summoning top military officials for an unusual meeting next week. We'll bring you the details. And with the government shutdown countdown underway, the White House is now threatening mass firings for certain agencies. We'll discuss that story and more with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kate Davidson, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll turn back to the impending government shutdown deadline ahead with our political panel. But first, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is summoning top military commanders for an unusual meeting early next week at the Marine Corps base at Quantico, Virginia, just hours before the U.S. government funding deadline. The Washington Post reporting now the forum may bring together more than 1,000 participants. A Pentagon spokesman did not say what the leaders will hear from Hegseth, who's, of course, overseen the replacement of top commanders since he's been on the job and the shutdown of programs that promoted diversity among the ranks.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is opening a new safety review of the abortion pill at the urging of conservative and anti-abortion advocates. The medication is used in 2/3 of abortions in the U.S., in part because it can be prescribed and delivered through telehealth providers in states where abortion is otherwise banned or highly regulated. Kennedy is also considering adding certain autism symptoms to an official list of side effects that can be compensated through the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which shields companies from lawsuits and pays out to those who experience a serious reaction to a covered vaccine.
And lawmakers in Utah releasing 6 proposed redistricting maps to comply with a judge's ruling last month that found the existing borders gave Republicans an unfair advantage. Must be redrawn. The maps are available for a 10-day public comment now and will then advance to a state judge for consideration. Democrats seeking a compact district within Salt Lake County, which would help them break the Republican strongholds on the state's congressional delegation. Republicans won all 4 districts in the 22 and 24 elections under a map that split the Democratic area in 4 ways. And as we count down to what appears to be a more likely government shutdown next week, this evening's political panel is with us now. Democratic strategist Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions, alongside Republican strategist Annalise Keller, partner at 7Letter. It's great to have both of you with us. Kristen, you spent enough time on Capitol Hill to have a sense of this, and you've lived through a couple of shutdowns. We've been talking about it for weeks. What does the Trump administration do, as Congressman Flood said, when it gets the keys to the castle? The director of OMB put out a memo describing exactly what many thought: mass layoffs. Does that make a shutdown more or less likely?
I think the Democrats are in a tough position because Democrats by nature do not want to shut down the government. They want to see the government work. But I think there's a breaking point, and they're looking at these, the healthcare subsidies, the Medicaid subsidies, and seeing, we have to fight, and the American people want us to stand up and fight. Now, the administration is playing hardball, and the OMB is playing hardball, and I think that they don't necessarily. I mean, I think that a goal is to fire this many people. So, I don't think it's. I think.
So we set a trap for Democrats.
It's setting. Well, I mean, it's not a trap. It's just, something that they're willing to do. And if you come to the bargaining table, and Democrats don't want to see this happen. At the end of the day, though, you saw what happened when Senator Schumer kind of buckled last time around, and the blowback that he received. And so, and you see his stance right now is just holding strong. And I think maybe they're looking at this and saying we have to do this in the short term in order to get what we want over the long term.
And Elise, we were talking to Congressman Mike Flood about the federal workers in his district. Obviously, this would have a very big impact on the DMV, the District of Columbia, Virginia, Maryland. But there are federal workers all across the country, and certainly lots of them in Republican districts. I mean, how will, Republican lawmakers explain this to their constituents? Is this what they really want, these mass firings?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kristen's correct here in that Republicans have threatened this. They threatened this in the March shutdown. They've talked about the White House threatened in the March shutdown that they would do this. This is a memo that's been circulating for a while now. I think Republican offices have been aware that this is out there. And, to Kristen's point, Republicans have shut down the government before. Remember, they shut it down in 2013. I was on Capitol Hill when Republicans shut the government down then. And they were the instigators of the shutdown, and they were blamed for the shutdown. So I do think there is a big political risk in what the Democrats are doing right now because they are the instigators. Remember, this is a 7 weeks clean CR of Biden spending levels. So Democrats are saying that they are not going to pass that. But that's only a 7-week funding measure. So they're going to have to come back in November and vote on this thing again to fund the government. Yeah, this is just phase one.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun Christmas around here either way. We heard today on the early edition of Balance of Power from Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, who's actually on the Appropriations Committee, had this reaction to the memo that came out from the White House. Let's listen.
Donald Trump and Russ Vought have been salivating to be able to have their way with hiring and firing. They are just trying to use intimidation tactics and to distract the American people from the focus we need to have, which is making sure that we can pass a government funding bill that lowers people's costs, that eliminates the cuts, and that saves people's health care. If the Republicans just shrug their shoulders and ignore this, then they are giving the middle finger to millions of people who need to make sure they can keep their health care costs affordable.
Enter Hakeem Jeffries on X. He tweets, "Listen, Russ, you're a malignant political hack. We will not be intimidated by your threat to engage in mass firings. Get lost." Is that a strategy? Are we shutting down?
Oh, I think we're definitely shutting down.
We're definitely shutting down.
It's just how long are we shutting down for? I mean, we can't continue on that path forever. And I think coming to the table, the White House, scheduled a meeting, then canceled the meeting. The Republicans couldn't get to 50 votes with their own CR in the Senate. So it's not entirely on the Democrats here. The Republicans need to come together amongst themselves and figure out what they can get through the Senate. I think there's a lot of back and forth in social media, and then there's what actually happens on the ground, in Congress with people talking. And there's some members talking across the aisle, but I think there's also how you communicate with the American public. And the American public, what they know is that Donald Trump is in the White House and the Republicans are in charge of the House and Senate. So I think we'd do well to remember that, and who are they going to blame when everything shuts down, which is not a good thing, by the way.
Yeah.
You talked about the timing here, the length, Kristen. Sometimes these shutdowns, as we know, might just be a few hours or a couple days. During President Trump's first term, we had, I think, the longest one ever, something like 35 days. So what is this sense, Annalise, how long this could last? I mean, sometimes these things seem like they're going to go on forever, and then they're resolved quite suddenly.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I'm really of two minds because Schumer has to shut it down. We all know that. He's got so many political pressures. He's facing a lot of internal politics in the state of New York. There's a lot going on, pressure from the base. He's got to show he's willing to fight. But he is someone who I think fundamentally wants the government to function. He wants there to be an open government. Okay. I could see him there is a deal to be made around health care. I don't think that they're going to, take back some of the president's, big beautiful bill provisions. They're not going to roll that back, but there's a deal to be made. It just to me, it depends whether he's willing to take that first sort of fig leaf. If he's willing to take it, and it could be a couple of days, but then on the flip side, I also could see this going a couple of weeks and them really digging in and saying we really need to make a big point here if Republicans and Democrats really go to the ends of their corners. But, they do need Democrats in the Senate. We have to get 60 votes in the Senate. That's how it works. So Democrats are going to have to pass this in the Senate to reopen the government. That's the sticking point.
A new record, maybe, in the era of Trump. We would certainly believe it. While all of this is happening, we've got a potential shutdown swirling. 2 world leaders, 2 heads of state in the White House today. The president was busy unveiling late yesterday the Presidential Wall of Fame. I don't know if you guys heard this or saw it. It's a new portrait series at the White House. There you see it on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. Black and white photos of President Trump and his predecessors along the colonnade facing the Rose Garden, except this one. Joe Biden's photograph does not show Joe Biden. It's an auto pen, Kristen. Was this Saturday Night Live?
I mean, it is just the type of pettiness that you see come out.
You're not laughing at
this White House. It's infuriating because there's a lack of respect for the office of the presidency, and they got some hits on social media, and we're talking about it right now.
Yes,
but I think it's silly, and I think it's beneath the White House.
Classy move for the president.
No, I don't think so.
Kristen Hahn and Annalise Keller, thank you so much for being with us. To learn more about all these stories and more, make sure to check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Do we have the auto pen in there? I'll have to take a look. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. Alongside Kate Davison, I'm Joe Matthews. See you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.